The case involves an age discrimination suit by the plaintiff, Pat Thibodeau, a commission salesman, against his former employer, Kane Restaurant Supply. Mr. Thibodeau had worked for Kane for 15 years when he was asked to retire at age 65 under the company's mandatory retirement policy. After a brief vacation, Mr. Thibodeau consulted with an attorney and learned that mandatory retirement was illegal. Mr. Thibodeau went to see the company's owner and CEO, Robin Kane, and demanded his job back. After talking to his lawyer, Mr. Kane reinstated Mr. Thibodeau as a commissioned salesman. A year later, however, Kane terminated Mr. Thibodeau, alleging poor sales performance. Mr. Thibodeau has alleged that his sales performance suffered because Kane assigned him to new sales territory and changed its commission structures.
The mediation begins with a joint session. The mediator first asks the parties at counsel to introduce themselves and then turns the focus to the dispute.
Let me start out by just talking a little bit about the mediation process. John and Dahlia, I know you've both done a fair number of mediations, but I'm not sure about you, Mr. Thibodeau. You're shaking your head no.
No, this is my first time.
Your first time. Okay, Mr. Kane?
I have never done this before.
Okay. It seems that what might be helpful here is if I can help you understand and think through what some of the obstacles have been to getting this case resolved on your own, and also to think through some of the things that might be important to you as you think about how to get this matter behind you and get on with your business and with your life. Let me ask you if you all would begin and just tell us what you think is important for us to keep in mind as we go about the conversation today.
The following are brief excerpts from the parties' opening statements.
Well, I'd like to give just a short history of what this case is about.
Attorney Rudofsky then explained how the company's changes in commission structures disadvantaged Mr. Thibodeau. She characterized the case as a modern version of the play Death of a Salesman.
This is Death of a Salesman with a twist, with a malicious twist, because the salesman was doing fine until someone decided to kill him off. We're talking about $600,000 to $750,000, trebled, certainly doubled, maybe trebled. You're talking in excess of $1.5 million. We're willing to be reasonable, but we also believe that this is a significant case. I believe in the case. I will take it all the way.
Okay, thanks. Let me just ask you, Mr. Thibodeau, do you have anything you want to add at this point or have us keep in mind as we go about our conversation today?
I worked very closely with Bernie Kane. We almost, I would say, founded the company together, although my financial interest was not that. But because of things I brought to the company, ideas, territories, unexplored, that helped the company to grow from 10 people to whatever we have now, whether it's 40 or 50 people. My reputation was taken away, money was taken away, and tremendous emotional distress was added. So.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Let me ask you all too if you can maybe add in how some of the things that you think we ought to keep in mind here.
Certainly. The restaurant supply business is an extremely competitive business. And the Kane philosophy has been over the years that everybody has got to carry their own load in order to stay afloat. The core issue of this case is that Mr. Thibodeau was terminated because he was a non-producer, not because the company had it in for him.
Could I have a word in rebuttal, or would you prefer not?
Not quite. Let me just, in a few minutes, sort of try to set up some conversation here, but I just wanted to give Mr. Kane an opportunity first to add in whatever you want us to keep in mind here.
He had a good relationship with my father, who started the company, as did most of the employees in the company. The fact is that were we viewing this strictly in the business sense, we wouldn't have kept him on as a salesperson for even the last 5 years of his early 60s. We have responsibilities to not just one employee, but to all employees. And if we fail the business, we fail all of them. And so we are, as business people, forced to make decisions about who is contributing to the business and who is not. And times are changing whether we like it or not. I let him go only because it simply wasn't working out, and I just didn't think it was fair to the company and to the other employees.
Thanks. Daria, I know you wanted to add something. Let me try to set up a kind of a discussion. My goal here, and I think what would be most productive, is not to get into a point-counterpoint. You're not going to end this particular part of the mediation agreeing with each other, but my real hope is that if there are things that you're unclear about what the other side said, that we could have a dialogue about that. Does your
No, my
question fall
point,
into that category?
No,
or?
my point is simply to say we have serious dispute as to the facts,
Okay.
and we have documents to prove
Okay.
our version about
Okay.
performance. And if someone's been reformulating the books over there,
So that is an additional,
Well, I would
some
just like
question
to make-
about what the performance
Could I just make
was.
one other point? And that is to be able to walk into this room and to suggest that this company is positioned to pay something in the nature of $1.5 million is totally absurd. That is the kind of thing that would totally bankrupt the company and ruin the lives of everybody in it. And I think I'm frankly outraged that someone who's been as well treated by this company as this man has would walk into this room and make that kind of a demand and essentially ask for a free ride for the rest of his life.
Can I
Let me
respond?
just-
I
well-
really feel it needs a response.
Diane, let me just say one thing first before you do. I do understand that there are financial concerns on both sides here, and I also understand that we're at the beginning of the day here for resolution purposes, and just kind of understanding that that is so, my hope is that as we explore throughout the day some of the things that you've talked about here and some of the things that perhaps we haven't talked yet about, that we can work our way through.
Could I just
Sure.
say, I do want to clarify what I said. I was not suggesting that Mr. Thibodeau has any interest in bankrupting the companies. I was careful to phrase what I said in terms of what his losses have been.
Well, he hasn't.
That's-
He hasn't.
wait a minute,
Excuse
wait a
me. He
minute.
hasn't lost 3 times. What you said.
What? No, I
what
said-
you're claiming he's lost is about $500,000.
No, I didn't say that. You weren't listening carefully. What I said was his losses have been X. I got to about 750. And I said a court could award multiple damages. That's what your potential exposure is. That's lawyer talk for what you could get socked with. So that,
Well, there
I
was-
So
didn't,
I understand here that obviously there are different kinds of exposures, and you're talking about what you think the company's potential exposure would be with a court, and obviously there are different kinds of exposures here we could also probably talk about, sort of reputational interests and some of the concerns that you talked about, sort of your concerns about your own kind of, I think the word you used was self-respect and just getting on, being in your life the way you'd like to be in it, and obviously there are some concerns you have here as well.
Can I
and your
just say
expectation?
something to what Robin said? The only one who lost in this newer telephone arrangement, in this new idea of territorial split-up, there was only one person in the company that lost from that. That was me.
Okay.
All others gained from my loss. And
So for you, you really see a lot of changes that really were detrimental to you personally.
Yes.
Well, I mean, again, we're here because there is some disagreement about what happened. And I think those are some issues that it's a little unclear how much we'll go into detail on those or not. But I do hear the concern that you have about sort of your own performance here, and clearly, Mr. Kane, you were talking too about your sort of business interests here particularly as well, and how those will play out in the course of the day today remains to be seen, I think. Unless there are other questions, I would suggest that we begin to try to meet separately so I can learn a little bit more about some of the things that are important to you here. Listening to you in the initial joint session, it's pretty clear to me that this has been a tough situation for you, and I appreciate that as we go forward. Obviously, if we're able to get this resolved, I'm sure it will make a big difference, and it's something that sounds like you've been carrying around for a while, so I just appreciate that. I have a couple of things I'd like to accomplish, and again, I'm sure there are some things that you'd probably also like to do. I would, at least at the beginning, like to find out if there's other things that you want to be sure that I know about that you didn't talk about during the joint session.
The plaintiff again stressed that success was based on long-term relationships, which put him at a disadvantage in the new territory.
just between you and me, and this does not go out of the room.
I have a red pen, I'll just put a big C here.
Treble damages is not something any reasonable lawyer counts on. the damages are still enormous here. If they're going to be in the $25,000 to $50,000 range, there's no point us wasting your time or anyone
Sure.
else's time today.
Well, I want to get into that in a few minutes about where you are actually. And I tell you, you and I have never worked together in mediation. Let me tell you a little bit about the way I work, which is to try to have a conversation between us about where you might be monetarily. It's always a little bit tricky to find out when the right time is to start exchanging offers. I think it's a little early to do that at this stage of the game, but I would like to have a sense about where you are. Before we get to that, though, let me just have a little bit of a sense about a topic we haven't talked about yet, and that is some of the things that you're really concerned about here. It sounds like you're working part-time.
Mr. Thibodeau said that he'd been employed part-time at a hardware store, earning barely more than minimum wage. This had been an embarrassing and difficult time.
But I have had some very large expenses about my mother in a nursing home in the past year, and that's been very draining on whatever monies I did have.
Sounds like maybe financially draining and draining in other ways for you as well during this time.
Well, yes, of course, but I can't blame that on Robert.
No, understood. Yeah, absolutely.
But financially, a tremendous drain.
Sure. And it sounded to me in terms of when you were talking about before that this job at Kane was really important to you both financially and just in terms of your own sense of...
What does a salesman have? Clean shirt and shine on his shoes, so to speak.
Yeah.
I always managed that.
Yeah.
And that's sort of part of your self-respect.
Sure.
And when you suddenly are told that your shoes don't look so shiny anymore, it's and you're a drawback to a company that you feel you had a big hand in helping to become successful.
More about your relationship with Robin.
Mr. Thibodeau talked further about his long social and professional relationship with the company's founder, Bernie Kane, and the transition to leadership under his son, Robin.
Well, let me go back and tell you a little bit why and again, this is an early stage of the mediation, and I'm just kind of, again, trying to do the landscape here and see what might be possible. One of the things, and I obviously haven't talked with them about this at all, but given the fact that you were talking about how much being at work and being a salesman means to you, I mean, I don't know whether there's any possibility of you're going back to Kane Restaurant. And obviously, if your relationship weren't a good one, I'm not sure I would suggest it, but having heard your answer, is that something you'd ever consider?
Well, we talked about that.
Did you?
And yes, I would consider it, but I would consider it under circumstances that probably couldn't happen.
Give me some details on that, because that might be helpful
An
to me.
apology and an admission that I was dealt a bad hand by him. I don't think he would ever do that.
Well, let me just
I
explore that
couldn't
just
go
for...
back and work for the man after what he did to me.
Especially after some of the remarks he
Yeah.
made. You know,
Sure.
threats to bring up irrelevant personal stuff that he is privy to. That's, that's a little below the belt.
Well, obviously, this is in a lawsuit kind of context. It's not surprising that things do get said back and forth in a way, then that's unfortunate. And obviously, you're here to try to see if we can resolve this or address this in a different kind of way. Let me go back, though, to when you talked about an apology. It sounded when you were describing about why that was important, that to go back after some of these things had said back and forth without some sense that things would be better going forward in terms of the relationship. Is that what's at the heart of that for you?
I think it's important to add into that mix money. I mean, I've lost money and I've had to dig into money and I don't have much money.
I think it's too early to start trading numbers at this stage, but I would like to have, and I'll be working with the other side as well, to try to formulate where you'd like to begin that process if in fact, if we do go that second route. So some conversation between the two of you while I'm working with the other side about what that number might be and a framework for discussing it, I think would be helpful. I am going to be working hard with both sides here, but that probably will call for some tough decisions as we go forward that you'll have to analyze in relation to the costs and the risks of going to trial. Anything that you're concerned about my sharing with the other side?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Let me go meet with them then, and I will be back with you in about half an hour or so. Well, thanks for your patience. I actually had a helpful conversation with them, I think. Again, just a general conversation about some of the things that came up in the joint session and some of the things they're really concerned about. So I'm glad we're having this opportunity also. I guess just to sort of start out too, it sounds like there's some real concerns on your part, Mr. Kane, about the business aspect of this. You took over from your dad and are running the business at this point. I'd like to hear more about that. I also have some questions about some of the things that were said in the joint session and some of your pre-mediation submission papers. What else do I need to know at this point that you don't think I heard before?
Well, I would simply make this point, and that is that I don't think it really matters to me at this point what the potential amount of their claim is, because my resources are finite. And if this case doesn't settle, and if it goes to court, and if they get a judgment of $1.5 million or $2 million or $3 million, all that will occur is that this company will go into bankruptcy.
Mr. Kane went into detail regarding the company's current debts, and his attorney stressed the weakness of the plaintiff's claims. The mediator shifted the discussion to the history of the company and its relationship with Mr. Thibodeau.
What was your relationship with Mr. Thibodeau at the time? Had you...
Well, he was, I think he's correct in the sense that he is really more a member of my father's generation than of my generation. Pat is out of the old school and seems stuck in his ways and unwilling to adapt to the demands of a changing economy.
Let me ask you about another aspect of this that's been raised, and that is the whole question about the change in the policy on commissions. And tell me a little bit more about when that happened and what the rationale for that was.
There are two aspects. The commission structure changed in two ways. One is it changed what I'll call a territorial change, and that is that, just as I was saying before, as the business has changed, now we're dealing with corporate entities that are developing restaurants across jurisdictional boundaries, territorial boundaries. And we needed to change the commission structure to recognize that reality.
The emphasis became first contact.
That's correct.
And it had previously been territorial.
Correct.
Well, I guess as I hear what Mr. Thibodeau was saying, that he feels that he was disadvantaged unlike anybody else was by this change, and so has
That's just not
some
true. That just isn't
understanding.
true. He may have suffered more extensively than others because of his sales practices, but there was nothing about the policy that was designed to prejudice one particular employee over another or to advantage one group of employees over others.
If the policy had not been changed, were his performance figures would have stayed the same? That's what I'm hearing him say here.
Well,
No,
in
what-
fact, they stayed about the same, low. That was part of the problem. Whether you have the prior policies or the latter policies, he wasn't a great performer under either policy.
Did you ever have any conversations about his performance before his retirement?
More and more, a focus of discussion with the sales force generally, that we needed to put increasing emphasis on the development of new business, new accounts, as opposed to simply servicing existing accounts.
In response to some probing, Kane acknowledged Thibodeau's skill with client relationships, which could be important for servicing restaurant chains.
One of the things that you talked about is the real concern you have about, or the desire for a collegial atmosphere here, and that obviously Mr. Thibodeau's leaving did have some impact there, and clearly there are some exposures that we've talked about here. Just, again, in the interests of seeing what might be possible here, have you ever given any kind of consideration to having Mr. Thibodeau reemployed by the company?
Well, I can answer that. I didn't mean to suggest by my earlier remarks that he was disliked. That's not the case at all. I think that this is absolutely an outrage as to what has happened here.
this lawsuit, and certainly is something that Mr. Thibodeau has talked about too, that has been a very difficult for the relationship, and obviously this something would have to be worked through. Are there other capacities other than a salesman that you think might be possible here?
Well, I think that he could play a very valuable role in what I would characterize generally as sales support, both by virtue of his experience and his customer service approach.
Mr. Kane emphasized that while he was flexible regarding precisely how a job might be structured, he would not pay an exorbitant salary or a large upfront amount.
Are there some expenses that you see as legitimate that he might get recovery from the company?
Well, I think we would focus primarily on what's perceived as lost wages to date.
The discussion went into further detail regarding what might fairly be counted as Mr. Thibodeau's losses to date.
Is it fair to say that as a principal, and I'm kind of guessing here based on the categories that you're talking about, that you might be willing to talk about at least putting him in a position that he might have otherwise been in financially, although there's some question about what the lost wages were, but putting him in the same kind of position he would have been in had he not left the company?
I think that's something we would consider, depending, again, it depends on what else comes along with that.
Well, I would also respond to that question with a question. Is this something that he appears to be interested in?
I think he does appear to be interested in it, which is why I'm trying to get a little more detail here about what you all had in mind, and I think that's obviously something that is worth exploring. It might make a big difference, certainly in terms of the finances here, to try to get this case resolved. And not to say that we shouldn't probably have a conversation about what it might take if we aren't able to do reinstatement, and comparing that, of course, to some of the risks which we haven't talked about yet. My guess is also that there is going to be, realistically, to try to get this case resolved, a question of attorney's fees.
Well, I have a real problem with the notion of rewarding the kind of advocacy that we saw this morning.
Well, it certainly sounds as this has been a fairly acrimonious litigation. Just from a practical standpoint, my guess is that that's going to have to be part of the mix. There may be ways of framing that or
I would
allowing
at least
for
want
additional payments.
I would insist that if that's the case, then there should be some reciprocity in the form of an apology, because he has put this company through torture by bringing this lawsuit and by pursuing it in the way in which he did. And yes, it is acrimonious, and it's largely acrimonious because of the tactics that he and his lawyer have adopted during the course of the litigation.
How much of that do you think is actually Mr. Thibodeau himself, and how much of that do you think is just the normal course of a litigation that has been somewhat protracted, as I gather?
I think Mr. Thibodeau was well aware of the kind of aggressive adversarial style that his lawyer adopted, and I'm very offended by it, frankly.
Sounds like what you're concerned about here is just some acknowledgement of the impact that has had. Let me see if I can just summarize where we are, I think, at this point, and it's really been a helpful conversation, and I want to go back and talk to Mr. Thibodeau and his lawyer at this point. I think what I'm hearing is that, at least for one option here, if there can be a working out of exactly what Mr. Thibodeau's job would be, you'd be willing to talk about some of the financial aspects of that.
Well, I think that the way I'd like to leave it with, if you're going to go back to them, is that this is an option that my client has said he would go along with and certainly address. But if we're going to proceed down that assumption, we want to put to bed any significant financial settlement beyond that.
Well, I suppose, what one calls significant may differ from one side to
Well,
the other,
let
and
me
that's
be
what
clear,
this is all
let
about.
me be clear
but,
that a
yeah.
significant financial is any number that is anywhere close to six figures or anything like that.
Well, that's obviously a conversation that we're going to have.
All right.
But I do hear at least that you're willing to talk about the categories that might basically put him in the same position, that while you're concerned about the way this litigation is going along, attorney's fees may be part of this as well. And I also heard the other aspect which we need to address here, which is the concern about there's been so much water over the dam here. How do we get some acknowledgement of the impact of the company? And my guess is probably from his perspective, for him to go forward. There are some similar kinds of acknowledgments that he may want to get from you as well. I think while I'm talking with them, it might be helpful for you to have more of a conversation, try to flesh out some of the details of what would make this work from your perspective.
Okay, that's fine.
Actually, we're making progress here, I think. There is some receptivity on the other side, actually, to your coming back to work at Kane Restaurant.
Really?
And that certainly seems like an avenue that's worth exploring a little bit further. I think there's a couple of things involved here that we ought to spend some time talking about. One clearly is the question about what kind of job you might have if you went back. A second is what else would be involved financially, because I know that you said that there were some things that you'd be looking for, and there's some receptivity, although I think that probably we're going to have to do some hard bargaining about that number. And the third aspect to it clearly is the kind of concerns that you raised about some acknowledgement from the company about some of the things that you've been through. And I think from the other side, if you were to go forward and work for the company, there are some kinds of acknowledgements they'd like to hear from you as well.
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm stepping on a wonderful decision that's about to be made, but what could I possibly do to, I didn't fire me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what have I got to say?
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you did it, but I'm coming back?
No, I don't think that's at all what they're looking at. I think.
What are they looking at?
But I think that there is a just concern if you're going back in some ways and being part of the team at
Well, I
Kane
have
Restaurants.
concerns myself.
Exactly. I think you both do, and I think that sounds like a conversation that would be really a useful one for you to have with Mr. Kane. Let me go back in terms of the question about what type of job might be possible. I don't know if the two of you have talked. My guess is, since it is another job and a different kind of job, they may be starting at a different kind of salary figure here.
The mediator suggested holding the salary issue aside and requested that the plaintiff provide a dollar demand to cover damages and losses to date, assuming new job terms could be agreed upon. The plaintiff team stated its demand would be over $200,000 and authorized the mediator to communicate that to the defendant. The mediator quickly went to the defendant, Mr. Kane, and counsel, and communicated the plaintiff's proposal. Kane responded with an offer of $95,000, the employment terms to be agreed upon. The mediator left the plaintiff team to consider their response while she met with the defendants in their second caucus.
Let me report on where I think we're up to, and I've got a suggestion for you.
All right, fine.
We, I think, are on a good track in terms of the potential job that might be worked out in terms of Mr. Thibodeau coming back to Kane, and talked about an inside job and some of the salary levels. I think we still got a little bit of work to do in terms of the salary level, but as you know, he is willing to talk with you about that. And my suggestion is, if we can work out the financial aspects of this, that we might benefit by a conversation between you and Mr. Thibodeau, also on some of the conversations that we've had about what you would need in terms of acknowledgments from him. And I think he understands some of that, and you understand some of the things he's concerned about, to have a conversation that will get you back in that May. Let me talk about the finances a little bit, because when we left off here, I think the 6 figures was a real barrier to you here.
Finances meaning other than the job-related materials.
Other than the job,
Fine.
exactly. What else we need to get this resolved? And I know that last time, as I told you, when I was talking with the other side, they were way up in the over 200,000 here. And let me make a suggestion about that. I mean, obviously, we've talked about some of the risks that you face going to litigation, and some of the real benefits in being able to get this resolved, both from a business and a financial perspective from you. I wondered whether, if we looked at some of the places where each of you were objecting to the other side's calculation of what would be paid here, we might make some progress. One of the things that you took into account when you got to your $95,000 figure here was you were subtracting some of the money that Mr. Thibodeau had earned at the hardware store, and we're also back to the concerns you had about a high attorney's fees, given the way this litigation has been conducted. And I have to tell you, I think that the salary, for example, that he got from the hardware store is a really tough issue for him. I think that gets you roughly around 180, and I can go through the figures with you. Obviously, that's more than you wanted to resolve this case for.
Absolutely.
But my sense is, after going back and forth, that again, with some real pushing on them to get them under their $200,000 figure, that may be what it takes to get this case resolved.
Is 180,000, is this, are we to understand your proposal?
Well, I'm actually wondering whether if I can get them to come down to that level, whether you would consider going up on the attorney's fees and also not subtracting from the amount that you had calculated and getting to your 95, what in fact he had earned during the period of time when he was out.
If what we are paying is justifiable as compensation for money that was lost, I can live with that.
The mediator expressed appreciation for this, but noted the difficulty she had had in getting the plaintiff down to near $200,000. After talking privately, Mr. Kane and his lawyer agreed to make a new offer at $150,000 if the mediator would tell the plaintiff that it was offered reluctantly and at the mediator's express urging. The mediator agreed to do this.
I think that we are just about there right now, and I want to come back to you with a couple of ideas here. I know that there were, you were really concerned about that 180 figure and at least getting that as a minimum. I think there's a willingness to get up to that amount if it's structured in some ways. There are a couple of possibilities. One is to have it paid over a longer period of time. I don't know what period of time you'd be willing to have this stretched out to be. Certainly 4 years is a possibility.
4 years would benefit me from a tax point of view, I gather. I think that's the one I would choose.
Okay. Well, let me just mention one other piece here, because I think if this piece falls into place, we really do have a resolution. And that is the going back to something we talked about a lot earlier, which is the kind of conversation that probably needs to take place between you and Robin. And just as you are looking for some recognition, as you put it, about the difficulties that you've had because of this termination, Robin is hopeful of some kind of conversation from his end too. Any kind of statements that you might make about just understanding what this has been in terms of his experience in the last year and a half or so probably would go a long way towards launching you into the future.
The mediator met briefly with the defendants to communicate the plaintiff's acceptance of the offer of $180,000 paid over 4 years and suggested that the parties reconvene.
Robin, this has been a tough time for me, and I know it's been a tough time for you too, and for the business.
I never meant to hurt you in the way in which the events of the last few years has apparently done so, and I deeply regret that.
Okay, well, we have a few more details to work out. Let me just suggest that we all kind of take a quick break here and get some coffee and then do the work of putting the rest of these details to bed.
Good idea.
Very good.